Marge introduced the Pendolini literacy quiz in poorly resourced schools in South Africa. Scores of teams from schools who have been participating for over 5 years have risen steadily, from 40 to 80%. The South African Department of Education is using the Pendolini?
Yep.
Pendolini quiz. See, I've learned something. The Pendolini quiz is a pilot project in 45 new reading clubs from 2018. But I believe this is going to be a history lesson.
Yes,
is that right?
It is.
So I think you're in for a real treat now, ladies and gentlemen. Without further ado, Marge.
Thank you. Thanks. I've got a handout. I'm mic'd up. Thanks. So, good afternoon and thank you for coming. You would have heard Simon Sharma talk today about the importance of history in terms of understanding where we are moving towards, where we've come from, but also I believe that history, as he said, is a critical thinking subject, that it's not just a narrative, it's not just a story. So when I teach history, I teach it in a way that arouses curiosity, gets the children to wonder about things. I don't teach it just as I'm going to tell you what happened. And I also teach it to generate empathy. And I believe that an understanding of what made people become perpetrators, what made them become collaborators, what made them be resistors in society, what made them be the apathetic bystanders, really helps us understand the forces that shape history. So one of the inspirational websites around history is Facing History, Facing Ourselves. And in South Africa, if we don't face our history, we cannot face our future. The youth that I teach are very angry that after apartheid, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but it was quick, done, dusted, right, there you are, you're all friends, go on, and everything's solved. That's not the case. So we need to unpack the layers of history, face them, and really work towards a proper social and economic justice in our country that hasn't happened. And one of the main reasons that economic justice hasn't happened is because of the 1913 Land Act. If you look at poverty in South Africa, most of the poor are in these areas that people were forced into. And those areas didn't start under apartheid. They started in 1913 with the Segregation Act, which was a collaboration of British and Afrikaner whites to create a black labor pool in our country. So, 1910, the British and the Afrikaners had been fighting each other. The British won because they brought in soldiers from the empire and they got their hands on the gold. But they needed the Afrikaners because the whites, English and Afrikaner, were outnumbered. So they collaborated. And again, that's an example of collaboration for economic wealth. Black people were put in reserves, and those reserves were bits of traditional land where they were allowed to be. But to make sure they left those traditional lands, they were taxed. Hut tax, dog tax, poll tax. And that tax had to be paid in money. So people were forced to come and work in the mines to pay these taxes. Is it working? Yeah. And with the Land Act, with black people being moved into 13% of the land in South Africa, and black people were 87% of the population, the reserves became overcrowded, and they could not compete as farmers with white farmers because the land was hopelessly overcrowded. So the roots of rural poverty in our country were born. And we still have that rural poverty in our country because we have not looked at the issue of land in our country. We've had a Land Restitution Act, but it did not do enough. So we have overcrowding, soil erosion, water shortages, poor facilities, and in segregation and apartheid, pass laws. Sorry. So these areas here are the areas where black people were moved into, first under segregation and then under apartheid. But to make sure that black people didn't gang up, they were told, you're different. You're a Xhosa, you're a Zulu, you're a Tswana, you're a Sotho. You're different. So you need your own homelands. So those were for the Xhosa. That was also a homeland. Look at how many pieces of that homeland for the Zulu. And these little pieces here were for a homeland called Boputa Tswana. So there were many homelands, and these red arrows are the arrows of communities that had bought land under white man's law before the 1913 Land Act. And now, under apartheid, they were told, you are a black spot in white South Africa, and you must move into your homeland. The main aim of these homelands was, once black people were in there, that the government paid a president of that homeland, because they were not sustainable by themselves, and encouraged that president to take independence. And those would become independent countries, and there would be no black South African citizen. So this was the plan of apartheid. Look at how much land the whites would have, and the black people would be herded into these areas. So this map was drawn by a member of the Black Sash, the organization I belong to, and we were trying to educate the world and form lobbies against this policy of forced removals. And that was my role in Black Sash. Sorry, this is not okay. The black communities, these black communities that had bought land before the Land Act, were flourishing, really prosperous communities. And many tribes came to the Black Sash and reported that they had been told that they were going to be moved from their land, and Black Sash decided to set up track and help these communities resist. What is Black Sash? It was formed in 1955, women protesting against the legislation under apartheid to remove colored people, mixed-race people, from the voting rights. And this woman was having coffee with 4 other women, and they decided to protest against that act, and they decided that each one of them would phone 10 people, and those people would phone 10 people, and in 6 days they'd collected 100,000 signatures. The power of 4 women. So Black Sash protested against the apartheid regime, worked with many different organizations, and Nelson Mandela, when he became president, said that Black Sash was the conscience of white South Africa. And that was a typical Black Sash, the early Black Sash stand, where women would stand silently with a message about apartheid laws. My experience was to work as a field worker with rural communities fighting forced removals. Very few white people had an understanding of what happened to black people. We were kept separate, and there was censorship, so people did not know. I worked with township activists, and these people faced great oppression. And as a white woman, I was open to repression as well, but not to torture. I was detained, but these guys, he was so badly tortured and kept in solitary confinement, Jomo, that he emerged with diabetes from stress when he came out of prison. and it was detention without trial, no lawyers. These were the skills I developed. I read legislation, regulations. I formed policy development around the whole issue of land, liaised with lawyers, press, advocates, embassy, brought Senator Edward Kennedy to communities to get good publicity. And so, I've given you a very quick run through. Now, what I would do, on the table in front of you, you might have a source. And I stop now and I say to the children, you've got a brief overview of Black Sash. And I'm doing this obviously faster than I would in the classroom. Have a look at the source in front of you and tell me, just write down 2 things that you see, 2 things that you think it means, and 2 things that you wonder about. What do you wonder about? And if you want to do that, because it's a way of me understanding and making my pupils' thinking visible. So I want to know what they are curious about with that brief overview. And it's now your turn to make your thinking visible. So the people that have got sources in front of them, the people that came in more recently, apologies, but these are the sources that people would have. There's a book on the Black Sash. Sorry. The Black Sash women would stand in silent vigil with this. And I'm going to ask the people who've got a particular source, I'm just looking for it. That one. What did you see in that picture, and what do you wonder about? What do you think it means? Sorry?
Why she brought the baby to the protest.
Okay, so why did that person bring the baby to the protest? So this is so we're going to do the wonders at the moment because of time. So this is the photograph. And the question is, they wonder why this mad woman brought her baby to a protest. This mad woman's me. And you can see I'm standing alone except for my baby because the law had changed. Because Black Sash women used to stand in those rows together, the state changed the law, the Riotous Assemblies Act. Anyone standing together is a riotous assembly. So we then had to stand alone. Now I'm not alone, I'm with my son. But I was waiting for the state president, and he was he was coming to visit down the road, and I had a Black Sash petition, but I had to stand alone. If anybody stood with me, it was an illegal gathering. So that's why I'm alone. And my son's there, and the state president stopped, and I gave him the petition. So that was it. Any wonderings about what you've got? This is where I have to use my glasses. Oh my gosh. Never had glasses when I was an active member of the Black Sash. So that's just a piece of paper that the baby's holding, but this is a Black Sash pamphlet which is against pass books or reference books for women. Initially, the government would only allow men to come out of the reserves to work, and women were kept behind at home. And that encouraged a lot of infidelity amongst black people, because black families were separated for like 11 months of the year. So women wanted to come and be with their husbands, but they were told they could only come if they had a pass. And the pass was if you had 3 days with that pass to look for work. If you did not find work, you had to go back to the reserves. If you found work, then you could stay for the time that you had work. So it separated family life. And what this says is the Black Sash did this is in the 1950s, and there was a big protest to the government. And it said, hundreds of thousands of men are in jail for past offenders, because if you were a man, you either starved in the reserves, the homelands, or you came to town. If you did not have a pass, you were breaking the law. So it was starvation or breaking the law. And now women were also going to be arrested if they wanted to be with their families. And the whole pamphlet is, what is going to happen to the children? So it was raising the family social economic issues of women also having to have passes. Thanks. Does anybody else want to wonder about something? Eddie? There it is.
Thank you. At our table, we have something called the Transvaal Rural Action Committee newsletter, number 1, 1983. And there's a symbol, there's a logo on the top, which is a black mother, by my guess, and her 2 black children, and she's carrying the frame of a bed on top of her head. And in the rest of the newsletter, it reports all these different areas and people being removed. And what I noticed was just this bit in big, bold letters right at the back, and it says, people are not being moved for their own good. And what struck me about that is, a very basic fact about these people being removed from their homes had to be declared in big, bold writing that this is not something they want to do. This is not something that's helpful to them. They're being forced against their will. And makes me think about today and, those courageous children who sat on the stage and talked to us about very basic facts that violence is taking their lives and their education away from them. And yet we don't have agreement on those basic facts, and we need newsletters to establish it.
Yeah.
So that was what I noticed.
That's a very important point you've raised, because the government, their rhetoric, their statement was, these people want to go and live amongst their own people in the homelands. They're not being moved by force. They want to live amongst their own kind. Black and white people are not made to live together. So what they did was, this is what they did. And Eddie, you led right into my next slide, where we had apartheid state tactics. So to get a community to move voluntarily, you would stop the old age pensions. And you would say to the old people, if you want to get an old age pension, you'll get it in the resettlement camp. They would bulldoze the school. If you want your children to go to school, go to the resettlement camp. They would stop the water supply. They would promise your tenants that you'd taken in land. They would divide and rule. And finally, they would use violence against the people who resisted. So that was what was happening, but the government was saying, no, they do want to go. So what we had to do, there's the bulldozed school of the Bakwena Bamagopa when they were moved, and we wrote a book, Track wrote a book called The Myth of Voluntary Removals, to highlight what the state's tactics were to get them to move. Thanks for the question. Any other wonderings about anything that's in front of you? Okay, so I'm not going to, yeah. Yeah.
I was just wondering who took the picture. Is it staged? What was the intent or the purpose of this specific picture? And what message is trying to be conveyed? Because there's not a lot of background information about it.
Good.
And we don't know anything about the source.
Right, so this is wonderful, because this leads me into why history is so important for critical thinking. Because I teach my children that text or a picture, anything without context, is a con. So text without context is a con. You'll get it. But it's just basically to say, you can't look at anything at face value. It would be fake news. So what is the context? So this was a Black Sash conference. This is my second child. And I think it's important, as a women activist, to show that having children doesn't stop you being an activist. So these are my first 2 children, and they were just with me in conferences, protests, whatever. And I was delivering a paper at a conference. And I think it's very important, because I work at a girls' school, and for women to see that women can make a difference. Thank you for asking that. Thank you. So, thank you. So very, very quickly, have I got 5 minutes? Am I over time? Got some, oh, I've got 7:50, great. I wanted to show you, so the community resisted in many ways, and this was one of the communities I worked with. They were moved finally because of their resistance at gunpoint at 3 o'clock in the morning, because the state saying to everybody, it's voluntary, didn't work. And finally the state took their gloves off and moved them at gunpoint. And this is the kind of place they got to. They got a tent, those tin shacks. Look at the land, there's nothing compared to what they had. And that woman has got that shack and just all her belongings outside. So what I would do there is also get the children to do what you did today, is do a see, think, wonder, or I would say to them, these people were moved by force. The other people went voluntarily with the bribed chief. But now these people have been moved by force to that chief that they rejected. How's the chief going to receive them? How are they going to be treated as the resistors? To get the children to kind of unpack with empathy the tensions that build up when you make choices. And to try and understand, and I mean, this was a lot, the Mokgopa people resisted for 7 years. And in 7 years, they were in 4 different places until they finally got their land back after court cases. Babies were born. Women took a stand, and that made a big difference to the tribe because it was a hierarchy of men making the decisions. But while they were in exile, women and youth met together and came up with plans to get their land back. That changed the decision-making in that tribe forever. So what the choices you make along the way define the structure of decision-making in your community. Again, it's women who, for many years, would always be subservient, but under times of stress, they became the heroines. Youth came up with a plan to go back to Mokgopa, and women and youth said they were going to Mokgopa just to clean the graves of their ancestors, and then they stayed, and they didn't go back. There was court cases, and I won't go through the whole story, but people died along the way, but finally they got their community back. And that's the old bulldoze school, and this is the new one. But they returned to Mokgopa. They were moved in 1984. They get back to Mokgopa. And I'm not, sorry, there's supposed to be something here. There. These are the people who held out. 400 families were moved, about 200 families resisted for 7 years. And those 200 families, these are their elders. Now, normally, under the Lekgotla tree, the decision-making tree, it would only be men. As a result of that removal, there are women and men. But look at their faces. It is a victory, but it is not a victory because they are totally divided. And I give the children sources and a lot of information about, don't ever think you lose your land, you resist, you get it back. It's not that easy. And today, the government is still talking about land. And unless we face this issue, and these people who got the land back, how did they treat the others that didn't resist all the way? Some of them said, well, you didn't come with us, you didn't pay the price, you can't come back. So it divided that once very united community. And that's, again, choices that people make, and we unpack that so that children can understand. History it's a complex subject. It's the social forces. And so what I do, I'll just show you. I use a flow map to introduce empathy. So, and the thinking maps are by David Hayil and Chris Yeager. And I just want to show you. So that's the map I use. So each step of the journey of the Mokgopa people, I give the children this, but this is from them. The children unpack at each stage of the journey What is the impact of that decision to resist? What is the impact of the decision to be bribed? What is the impact of the decision for women to decide on a strategy? So that we can see how every decision has an impact and shapes the future of our society. So thank you, and I don't know if you have any questions. We've got 2 minutes. Thanks. Thanks. And just like the resources back, yes.
How do we take this?
I think history is sometimes taught as fact. And the way I teach it is much more to see what the children wonder about and also to see the impact of decisions. And that becomes critical thinking, where I'm not telling you what happened. I'm giving you the brief narrative, and then with sources and with asking what's the context of the source, you start interrogating the sources that you have. And you interrogate sources for what's the purpose of the source? Is it staged? What was happening? Who took the photograph? When was it taken? And that's what we need. We need critical thinking youth. So sources must become a source of interrogation by your students. And so I deliberately give a little bit of information, and then I get the students to interrogate and to debate and to discuss and to wonder and to ask. And I think, whether I'm teaching forced removals or globalization, I think it's really important to develop critical minds. So that's it. Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming to the session. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
One more round of applause, please, for Mark.
Thank you.